Officer down! The radio crackled with static and panic as Max lunged through gunfire, a blur of black and tan fur against the darkness. His powerful jaws clamped onto the armed suspect's wrist, loyalty overriding the searing pain blooming across his own shoulder. The bullet wasn't meant for him. Handler Morrison dropped to his knees, face contorted in disbelief as crimson spread across Max's coat. The German shepherd's amber eyes never leaving his partner's face, even as his legs began to buckle. 4 years later, those same unwavering eyes stared vacantly from the corner of cage 17, the plaque beside it reading simply, Max, German Shepherd, age 9, unadoptable. The fluorescent lights flickered as 8-year-old Emily Roberts adjusted her hearing aid and glimpsed what no one else seemed to see, a hero forgotten. Tuesday, her birthday. The day the shelter had scheduled his final walk. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Phoenix summer heat shimmered off the pavement as Nancy Roberts guided her aging Buick into the Second Chance Animal Shelter parking lot. At 67, her hands bore the subtle tremor of advancing years, the gold wedding band still circling her left ring finger, catching the harsh Arizona sunlight. 5 years a widow, 2 years a guardian to her granddaughter, Nancy's life had become a series of unexpected chapters she'd never prepared to write. "Remember what we discussed, Emily?" Nancy said, adjusting the rear-view mirror to catch a glimpse of her granddaughter's face. "We're just looking today. A small dog might be best for our situation." Emily nodded, her chestnut hair bouncing around her shoulders. The hearing aid behind her right ear, a flesh-colored device that never quite matched her fair skin, had been upgraded twice since the accident that took her parents. At 8 years old, Emily had already mastered the art of reading lips, of interpreting the subtle language of faces that most people never noticed. "I know, Grandma," she replied, her speech clear but with the faintest pattern that revealed her impairment. "Something gentle." The shelter's interior smelled of disinfectant and wet fur, a cacophony of barks and whines that made Emily wince and adjust her hearing aid. Nancy noticed the subtle movement, the way her granddaughter's shoulders tensed at the sensory overload. 2 years of guardianship had taught her these small signals. Emily's discomfort rarely came with verbal complaints. Mark Dawson greeted them with the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had learned to balance hope with reality. At 45, he'd spent 15 years watching animals come and go, some to loving homes, others to fates he preferred not to dwell on during his off hours. "Welcome to Second Chance," he said, extending a hand to Nancy. "We've got quite a few smaller dogs that would be perfect companions. The terrier mix in the front has been very popular with families." As Mark guided them through the maze of kennels, Nancy noticed Emily lagging behind, her attention caught by something in the back corner, a section Mark seemed deliberately avoiding. The kennels here were larger, housing bigger breeds, most barking or pacing with pent-up energy. All except one. The German Shepherd lay motionless, head resting on massive paws, eyes open, but seeming to look through rather than at the world around him. A jagged scar ran across his right shoulder, the fur having grown back patchy and discolored. Unlike the other dogs, he made no effort to engage with potential adopters. "What about him?" Emily asked, her voice carrying that peculiar quality that sometimes drew stares from strangers. Mark's expression tightened. "That's Max. Former police, K9, not really suitable for families, especially with children." He lowered his voice, though not enough. "Scheduled for Tuesday if no one takes interest. Some dogs just can't adjust to civilian life." Tuesday, Emily's birthday. Nancy saw the connection form in her granddaughter's eyes, that stubborn set to her jaw so reminiscent of Thomas in his final days as a police officer. before the heart attack that left Nancy alone to face an empty house and silent mornings. "Can we meet him?" Emily asked, already moving toward the kennel before either adult could object. Nancy felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced when the police chaplain had appeared at her door 5 years ago. Some instinct told her that whatever waited in that kennel would change their lives irrevocably. Mark hesitated, keys jangling nervously in his hand as he glanced between Emily and the German shepherd. "I don't usually let folks interact with Max. He's complicated." He lowered his voice, addressing Nancy directly. "Former search and rescue, then patrol. His handler was transferred out of state after Max's injury. Handler's wife was allergic, or so they claimed." Nancy recognized the skepticism in Mark's tone, the same tone she'd heard at Thomas's funeral when fellow officers spoke of departmental support that never quite materialized for widows. "What happened to him?" Nancy asked, her eyes drawn to the scar tissue visible through Max's fur. "Took a bullet meant for his handler during a standoff. Damaged his shoulder pretty badly. Department veterinarian said he'd never work at full capacity again." Mark shrugged. "That's usually a career ender for these dogs." Emily had already crouched by the kennel, not touching the bars but studying Max with an intensity that made Nancy's heart ache. The shepherd's ears twitched slightly, the first sign he'd registered their presence at all. 5 minutes, Mark finally conceded, unlocking a side door that led to a small concrete yard surrounded by chain link. "We can use the meet and greet area." He entered Max's kennel with practiced efficiency, attaching a leash to the worn leather collar. The dog rose slowly, favoring his right front leg, but followed Mark's lead without resistance, a testament to his training rather than enthusiasm. In the enclosed yard, Mark positioned himself between Max and Emily. "Let him come to you," he instructed. "Don't make sudden movements or loud noises." Nancy watched as her granddaughter settled onto a bench, her small hands folded in her lap. Emily's hearing aid caught the sunlight, a beacon of her difference that had made her a target for schoolyard cruelty more than once. To everyone's surprise, Emily reached up and removed the device, setting it carefully beside her on the bench. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Nancy asked, tension creeping into her voice. "He doesn't need to hear my voice," Emily replied with the simple wisdom children sometimes possess. "He needs to see I understand." Max watched this unusual ritual, his head tilting slightly. Mark kept a firm grip on the leash, but the shepherd showed no signs of aggression or anxiety, just a weary acceptance of whatever human interaction was being forced upon him today. "Hi, Max," Emily said, her hands moving in the simplified sign language she'd been learning. "I'm Emily. Sometimes the world is too loud for me, too." The change was subtle but unmistakable. Max's ears perked forward, his eyes focusing on Emily's moving hands. He shifted his weight, the military stillness giving way to something resembling curiosity. "He was trained with hand signals," Mark explained, his voice betraying surprise. "Most K-9s are. They need to understand commands in noisy situations." Emily continued signing as she spoke. "People think I'm broken because I can't hear like they do, but I just hear differently." Her hands formed deliberate shapes, nothing specific to dog training, but somehow capturing Max's complete attention. "Maybe you're not broken either." Mark loosened his grip on the leash, allowing Max a bit more freedom. The shepherd took 2 tentative steps toward Emily, his movement stiff but purposeful. "Has he shown interest in anyone else?" Nancy asked quietly. Mark shook his head. "Honestly, he's been scheduled for euthanasia twice already. I've been buying him time, hoping—" He trailed off, watching as Max carefully approached Emily, sniffing the air between them. "Well, hoping for something like this, I guess." Emily remained still, allowing Max to investigate her on his terms. The shepherd's nose twitched as he caught her scent, his massive head lowering to her eye level. There was an ancient wisdom in those amber eyes, a creature who had seen humanity at its worst and its best, who had given everything for a bond that had ultimately been betrayed. "You were brave," Emily said softly, her speech slightly imprecise without the feedback from her hearing aid. "Like my dad. He saved people too." Max took another step forward, close enough now that Emily could feel his warm breath on her outstretched fingers. The moment hung suspended, fragile as spun glass. Then, with gentle deliberation, Max pressed his muzzle against Emily's palm. Nancy felt tears prickling behind her eyes. She'd seen this before, this precise moment of connection, in photographs of Thomas with his canine partners. The sacred trust between handler and dog that transcended words. "If we were interested," Nancy found herself saying, "what would be the process?" Mark seemed to snap out of his own amazement. "Well, there's an adoption fee, home visit, reference checks, but with Max," he hesitated, "there would need to be some special considerations, training continuation, understanding of his background." "Would a trial period be possible?" Nancy asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. "To see if he adjusts to our home environment?" Emily had slipped her fingers into the coarse fur of Max's neck, finding the spot behind his ear that seemed to please him. The shepherd had relaxed his posture, no longer the rigid military animal but something softer, more present. "We don't usually do trial adoptions," Mark admitted, "but given Max's situation and Tuesday's deadline," he glanced at his clipboard, "I could arrange something. You'd need to sign additional waivers, understand the risk factors of adopting a former working dog." Nancy watched her granddaughter with Max, seeing something she hadn't witnessed since before the accident, a genuine smile that reached Emily's eyes. The girl who had retreated into silence after losing her parents was reaching out, connecting. "He needs someone who understands him," Emily said, looking up at her grandmother with pleading eyes. "Please, Grandma. He's alone, like we were." The simple truth of it struck Nancy like a physical blow. They had been alone, she in her widowhood, Emily in her sudden orphaning, two broken pieces somehow forming a new kind of family, incomplete but surviving. Perhaps there was room for one more damaged soul in their patchwork household. "We'll need to make some adjustments," Nancy said, decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Our fence in the backyard, possibly some training for all of us." Mark nodded, relief washing over his features. "I can help with the resources. There's a specialist in town who works with retired service dogs, Dr. Jenkins. She could evaluate Max in your home environment." As they completed preliminary paperwork, Nancy couldn't help but wonder what Thomas would think of this decision. Her practical, steadfast husband had always approached life with careful consideration, but he'd also believed in second chances, had built his career on the idea that protection meant giving the vulnerable a fighting chance. The Arizona sun was setting as they led Max to Nancy's Buick, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The shepherd hesitated at the car door, perhaps remembering other vehicles, other journeys that had led to abandonment. "It's okay," Emily reassured him, her hand resting lightly on his good shoulder. "We're going home." Max studied her face, searching for truth in her expression. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. With a dignity that belied his circumstances, he climbed carefully into the back seat beside Emily. As Nancy adjusted her rearview mirror, she caught sight of them together, her granddaughter's small hand buried in the shepherd's fur, his massive head resting protectively against her leg. Already, something was healing between them, some silent understanding taking root. "Happy early birthday, Emily," Nancy said softly as she started the car. The girl's smile reflected in the mirror, bright as sunrise. "He's not my present, Grandma," she replied with unexpected wisdom. "We're his, The first night with Max transformed Nancy's orderly home into uncharted territory. She'd prepared a corner of the living room with a plush dog bed Mark had donated, one of the few items Max was familiar with, but the shepherd seemed bewildered by his new surroundings. He inspected each room with methodical precision, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors as he mapped the perimeter of his new environment. "He's securing the area," Nancy explained to Emily as they watched from the kitchen doorway. "Thomas used to say working dogs never really turn off their training." Emily nodded, clutching her storybook about a police dog she'd selected for bedtime reading. "He's making sure it's safe for us." After completing his inspection, Max returned to the living room but ignored the comfortable bed. Instead, he positioned himself near the front door, lying down with his head facing the entrance, ears alert to every sound from the quiet suburban street outside. "Should we make him go to his bed?" Emily asked. Nancy shook her head. "Let's give him time to adjust. This is all new and probably confusing for him." When bedtime came, Max watched silently as Emily prepared for sleep, following her nighttime routine with curious eyes. Nancy helped Emily adjust her hearing aid charger on the nightstand, a nightly ritual since the accident. The girl usually removed her aid at night, leaving her in near-complete silence until morning. "Good night, Max," Emily said, her hands forming the words alongside her voice. The shepherd's ears twitched in acknowledgement, but he remained at his self-appointed post by the front door. Hours later, Nancy woke to check on Emily as she often did. Padding down the hallway in her slippers, she froze at the sight of Max's empty spot by the door. Panic fluttered in her chest until she approached Emily's room and found the shepherd lying across the threshold, his body positioned so anyone entering would have to step over him. Not inside the room, respecting boundaries, but guarding nonetheless. Nancy recognized the posture from photos Thomas had shown her of canines protecting injured handlers in the field. "You found your purpose already, haven't you?" she whispered. Max's eyes gleamed in the darkness, neither threatening nor submissive, simply aware and vigilant. The morning brought new challenges. Max startled at the sound of the coffee maker, his body tensing as if preparing for threat assessment. A passing garbage truck sent him into high alert, a low rumble building in his chest until Emily placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," she said, her voice carrying the slight flatness of someone who can't fully hear their own volume. "Just regular morning noises," Nancy observed their interaction with growing fascination. Despite only meeting yesterday, Emily and Max seemed to communicate in a language of subtle gestures and expressions, a world where conventional hearing didn't matter. The doorbell rang, sending Max into a protective stance, his body angling between the door and Emily with practiced efficiency. "It's just Dr. Jenkins," Nancy said, showing Max the appointment card with the veterinarian's photo that Mark had provided. "She's here to check your shoulder." The shepherd's posture relaxed incrementally, though vigilance remained in his amber eyes. "Doctor." Sarah Jenkins proved to be younger than Nancy expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with short, practical hair and hands that moved with confident gentleness. "Former military veterinarian," she explained, kneeling slowly to Max's level rather than looming over him. "I worked with the K9 units in Afghanistan before opening my practice here." Max submitted to her examination with stoic dignity, flinching only slightly when she manipulated his injured shoulder. "The bullet damaged the muscle here," she explained to Emily, who watched with intense focus. "It healed, but not perfectly. He'll always have some stiffness, especially in cold weather or after exercise." "Does it hurt him?" Emily asked, concern etching her young features. "Sometimes, but we can manage it," Dr. Jenkins replied, speaking directly to Emily rather than over her head to Nancy, a courtesy that immediately elevated her in Nancy's estimation. "Gentle exercise, some supplements, maybe hydrotherapy if the budget allows. As Dr. Jenkins packed her medical bag, she paused, studying the interaction between Emily and Max with professional interest. You know, there's something remarkable happening here. Max is responding to Emily in a way that's unusual for retired canines. They typically struggle with the transition to civilian life because their training is so specific. Emily has always connected with animals, Nancy offered. Even before the accident, Dr. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. There's an emerging field of study about the bond between service animals and people with hearing impairments. The dogs become attuned to visual cues, body language. Max was trained to read subtle human signals. It's possible he and Emily are communicating on a level that bypasses conventional methods. The terminology sounded clinical, but Nancy understood the essence of what the veterinarian was describing. She'd witnessed it herself, the wordless understanding flowing between her granddaughter and this damaged warrior. Two souls communicating in a frequency most couldn't access. I'd like to document their progress if you're open to it, Dr. Jenkins continued. It could help other retired service dogs find appropriate placements. Before Nancy could respond, a sharp knock at the door sent Max back into alert mode. Nancy, it's Frank Peterson from next door. Got a minute? Nancy sighed, recognizing the neighborhood busybody's voice. Frank Peterson, a retired insurance adjuster with too much time and too few hobbies, had appointed himself the unofficial enforcer of the Homeowners Association rules. Let me handle this, she whispered to Dr. Jenkins, moving toward the door. Emily, why don't you and Max go to the backyard with Dr. Jenkins? But as she opened the door, Frank's eyes immediately locked onto Max, his expression shifting from neighborly nosiness to alarmed disapproval. Good Lord, Nancy, is that a police dog? In a residential neighborhood with children? Good morning to you too, Frank, Nancy replied with forced pleasantness. This is Max. He's retired from service and joining our family. Frank's eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Retired, maybe, but those animals are trained to attack. They're weapons with teeth, Nancy. My cousin worked insurance claims for the department. He's seen the damage those dogs can do. Actually, Dr. Jenkins interjected, stepping forward with professional authority, police canines are rigorously trained in controlled response. Max was primarily a search and rescue specialist, not an attack dog. Frank seemed momentarily taken aback by the veterinarian's presence, but quickly rallied. Doesn't matter. The HOA has restrictions about dangerous breeds and animals. Section 5, paragraph 3 clearly states, German Shepherds aren't on any dangerous breed list, Nancy interrupted, feeling a protective instinct rising that surprised her with its intensity. And Max has passed all behavioral assessments. Emily moved closer to Max, her small hand finding its way to his fur as if drawing strength from his presence. The shepherd remained perfectly composed, watching Frank without aggression but with undeniable awareness. Well, we'll just see what the association has to say about this, Frank huffed, already backing toward the door. People move to this neighborhood for safety and peace of mind, Nancy. A war dog with PTSD doesn't exactly fit that picture. After he left, Dr. Jenkins placed a reassuring hand on Nancy's shoulder. Unfortunately, this is common with retired service animals. People react from fear and misinformation rather than understanding. Will he cause problems for us keeping Max? Emily asked, her voice small but determined. Mr. Peterson can bluster all he wants, Nancy replied, surprising herself with her conviction. Max isn't going anywhere. The following days established new routines and revelations. Nancy discovered Max's training extended beyond protection. He could retrieve items on command, understood boundaries about furniture and food, and possessed an almost supernatural awareness of Emily's location at all times. The first major test came when Emily returned to school after the weekend. Max seemed to understand the concept of her departure, watching from the window as she boarded the school bus. But his anxiety manifested in restless pacing and frequent checks of her bedroom. "She'll be back this afternoon," Nancy assured him, wondering if she was foolish for speaking to a dog as if he comprehended complex time concepts. Yet when the school bus appeared at the end of the street that afternoon, Max positioned himself by the front window 5 minutes before its arrival, somehow anticipating Emily's return with uncanny precision. The true turning point came 3 days into their trial adoption. Emily returned from school with reddened eyes and hunched shoulders, telltale signs of a difficult day that Nancy had learned to recognize. "What happened, sweetheart?" she asked as Emily dropped her backpack by the door. "Melissa said my talking sounds weird," Emily replied, her voice deliberately flattened to hide emotion. "She told everyone I sound like a robot when I forget to check my volume." Max approached Emily, his movement purposeful. Instead of seeking affection, he nudged her hand with his nose, then walked to the back door, looking back expectantly. "I think he wants to show you something," Nancy suggested. In the backyard, Max led Emily to the shade of the old oak tree. There, to Nancy's astonishment, the shepherd demonstrated a series of movements, sitting, lying down, turning in a circle, all in response to Emily's presence without verbal commands. "He's waiting for your signals," Nancy realized aloud. "He wants you to direct him." Emily hesitantly raised her hand, mimicking the gesture she'd seen in a book about dog training. Max immediately sat at attention, eyes fixed on her with complete focus. "He's listening with his eyes," Emily whispered, wonder replacing distress on her face. "Just like I do." That evening, Nancy found Thomas's old police department yearbooks in the garage, leafing through them with a bittersweet ache in her chest. She hadn't examined these memories in years, finding them too painful after his sudden death. Now, she searched the K-9 unit photos with renewed purpose. On the third page of the 2018 yearbook, she froze. There, standing proudly beside a training officer she didn't recognize, was a younger Max. The caption read, "K-9 Max completes Advanced Search and Rescue Certification with Officer James Morrison." Not Thomas's direct partner, but certainly a dog he would have known, worked alongside. The connection felt like a ghostly thread linking her past to this unexpected present. Nancy was still processing this discovery when the phone rang. Mark from the shelter, calling with unexpected news. "The trial period was supposed to be 2 weeks," he began, "but there's been a development. The shelter's funding has been cut further. We're accelerating the—" He hesitated. "The timeline for some of our longer-term residents." Nancy understood the euphemism. "Are you saying they want Max back sooner?" "Actually, they want a final decision," Mark clarified, his voice heavy. "Either complete the adoption paperwork by Friday, or—" The unspoken alternative hung in the air between them. "I understand," Nancy said, looking out the window where Emily sat in the backyard, showing Max her school books. The shepherd lay beside her, attentive as any tutor, his damaged body positioned to shield her from the evening sun. In just a few days, this wounded warrior had awakened something in her granddaughter that months of therapy hadn't touched. And perhaps, though she was only beginning to admit it, he had awakened something in Nancy, too, a sense of purpose she'd lost when Thomas's heart gave out on that spring morning 5 years ago. "We'll be there Friday," she told Mark with quiet certainty, "with the adoption fee and paperwork completed." That night, as thunder rolled across the Phoenix sky, Nancy woke to the sound of whimpering. Following the noise to Emily's room, she found Max trembling beside the bed, caught in what could only be described as a nightmare. Emily, awakened by the vibration rather than sound, had her hand on his head. "He's remembering something bad," the girl whispered, "like my dreams about the accident." Nancy knelt beside them, her joints protesting the movement. "We all carry scars, don't we? Some visible, some hidden." As the storm intensified, Max gradually calmed under Emily's touch. The shepherd who had faced gunfire without flinching found comfort in the hands of a child who understood what it meant to navigate a world that sometimes seemed designed for others. In that moment, watching her granddaughter comfort this battle-scarred guardian, Nancy recognized the first turn in their shared journey, a path none of them had chosen, but which now seemed somehow inevitable, as if Thomas himself had orchestrated this unlikely reunion from beyond. The adoption became official on a Friday afternoon, Emily clutching the certificate with the same reverence she reserved for school achievement awards. Max seemed to understand the significance of the moment, sitting with dignified posture as Mark snapped a photo for the shelter's Happy Tales bulletin board, his first adoption success after 17 rejections. 17 families turned him down? Emily had asked incredulously when Mark shared this detail. Most people want a pet, not a partner, Mark explained. Max was trained to think, to assess situations. That intimidates folks looking for simple companionship. As spring melted into summer, Max's transformation continued in subtle but meaningful ways. The military stiffness in his bearing gradually softened, though he never fully abandoned his vigilance. His coat regained luster with proper nutrition and care, the scar tissue on his shoulder less prominent against the healthy black and tan fur surrounding it. More remarkable was Emily's evolution. The girl who had once hidden behind Nancy's skirts at school functions now walked with quiet confidence, Max a steady presence at her side during weekend excursions to the park or pet-friendly stores. Her speech therapist reported significant improvements in her vocal modulation, a development Nancy attributed to Emily's constant communication with Max, who responded to her voice regardless of its clarity or volume. "She's found her audience," the therapist explained during a progress meeting. "Max's unconditional attention has removed the performance anxiety that was impeding her progress." Dr. Jenkins documented these changes during her bi-weekly visits, her clinical notes evolving into something approaching wonder as she observed their deepening bond. "I've worked with service animals for 8 years," she confided to Nancy, "but the communication system they've developed is extraordinary." Emily uses modified sign language combined with verbal cues, and Max has adapted his training to her specific needs. The most dramatic illustration of this connection came during a thunderstorm in late July. Nancy had been folding laundry when the power failed, plunging the house into darkness. She'd fumbled for her phone flashlight, calling out reassurances to Emily. Before she could reach the hallway, Max appeared, gently taking her sleeve in his mouth and guiding her to Emily's room. There she found her granddaughter disoriented in the blackout, her hearing aid batteries dead, the charging station inactive without electricity, and now unable to see or hear in the darkness. Max had sensed her distress and sought help, acting as the bridge between them. That night, as they huddled together by candlelight waiting for power restoration, Nancy realized they had become something more than a woman, a child, and a dog. They were a unit, each compensating for the other's vulnerabilities. Word of their unusual family spread through the neighborhood, drawing mixed reactions. Some, like Margaret Wilson from the Senior Center, were charmed by the story of redemption and healing. "Like something from a Hallmark movie," Margaret declared after witnessing Max gently retrieve Emily's dropped hearing aid before it could be stepped on at a community picnic. Others maintained Frank Peterson's skepticism. "That dog's got military-grade training," Nancy overheard him telling another neighbor. "One trigger, one flashback, and someone could get hurt. Mark my words." Nancy might have dismissed these concerns entirely if not for the occasional reminders of Max's former life. The 4th of July had been particularly challenging, each firework explosion sending him into protective mode, positioning himself between the perceived threat and Emily, his body tense with remembered duty. It had taken hours of gentle reassurance to help him stand down from this invisible battle. That night, researching on her tablet while Emily slept, Nancy discovered online forums for handlers of retired military and police dogs, digital support groups sharing strategies for helping these animals transition to civilian life. Through these connections, Nancy learned about other retired canines struggling to find their place in the world after service. The stories both heartened and disturbed her. Tales of heroic animals abandoned by systems that had demanded their courage but made no provisions for their retirement. "It's like discarding veterans after they've given everything," wrote one former handler. "These dogs don't understand that their service is over. They're still waiting for their next mission." These revelations stirred something in Nancy, a sense of injustice she hadn't felt since advocating for better widow benefits after Thomas's death. She began compiling resources, reaching out to other adopters, even consulting with Dr. Jenkins about creating a more formal support network. "You know," Dr. Jenkins suggested during one of Max's checkups, "Emily's school has that community education day coming up. Have you considered having her present about Max? It might help address some of the misconceptions." The suggestion took root. With Nancy's guidance, Emily prepared a presentation about service animals, practicing her speech carefully with Max as her attentive audience. Principal Dorothy Miller had initially hesitated. "We need to consider liability issues," but relented when Emily's speech therapist endorsed the project as beneficial for her development. On presentation day, Emily stood before her classmates with new confidence, Max lying calmly at her feet. She explained his training, his injury, and the communication system they had developed together. "Max listens with his eyes," she told her peers, demonstrating how the shepherd responded to her hand signals. "And I hear with more than my ears." The highlight came when Emily removed her hearing aid, showing how Max alerted her to important sounds by touching her leg with his nose. When the principal deliberately dropped a book behind Emily, Max immediately signaled her, causing a ripple of amazed whispers through the classroom. Melissa, who had once mocked Emily's speech, approached after the presentation. "Can I pet him?" she asked tentatively. "You have to ask him properly," Emily replied without rancor, showing her classmate how to offer her hand for Max to sniff before touching him. This small moment of inclusion, Emily teaching rather than being taught, leading rather than following, marked another milestone in their journey. That evening, as Nancy prepared dinner, she received an unexpected call from Officer James Carter, a former colleague of Thomas's who still served on the force. "Heard about your adoption," he began without preamble. "Max was Morrison's partner, right? The shepherd who took a bullet during the Martinez standoff?" "Yes," Nancy confirmed, surprised by the contact. "Emily and I adopted him from Second Chance Shelter about 3 months ago." A weighted pause followed. "There's something you should know, Nancy. Max wasn't just any K9 in the unit. He was one of the last dogs Thomas worked with before—" Carter hesitated. "Before we lost him. Thomas was developing a training program for dogs like Max, ones who couldn't continue active duty but still had years of service left in them." The wooden spoon Nancy had been holding clattered against the stovetop. "Thomas never mentioned this to me. It was in the early stages," Carter explained. He called it Second Chapter, retraining retired K9s for civilian support roles. The department shelved it after he passed. Budget constraints. The revelation settled over Nancy like a mantle, both burden and blessing. "Why are you telling me this now?" Word got around after Emily's school presentation. Some of the old-timers remembered Thomas's project, thought you should know you're basically fulfilling his vision. After ending the call, Nancy stood motionless in the kitchen, processing this new connection to her late husband. Outside, through the window, she could see Emily and Max in the backyard, the girl reading aloud from her book, the shepherd attentive at her side. They had created something beautiful from their respective losses, something Thomas would have recognized and championed. The following week brought a new challenge when the Neighborhood Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting. The agenda, delivered to Nancy's mailbox in a formal envelope, listed a single item: discussion of dangerous animals in residential areas, Peterson residence. "He's actually going through with it," Nancy muttered, showing the notice to Dr. Jenkins during her next visit. "Frank's trying to force us to get rid of Max." The veterinarian studied the document with a frown. "This is unfortunately common. Fear often masquerades as concern for safety." She glanced at Max, who was demonstrating remarkable patience as Emily carefully brushed his coat. "Would you like me to attend? I can speak to Max's training and temperament from a professional perspective." The meeting, held in the community center's multipurpose room, drew nearly 30 residents, a record turnout for an association notorious for poor attendance. Nancy arrived with Emily and Max, the shepherd impeccably groomed and wearing a new harness Dr. Jenkins had provided, emblazoned with "Service Animal in Training." Frank Peterson stood at the podium, a folder of documents clutched in his hands. His wife Doris sat in the front row, her expression suggesting she might not fully support her husband's crusade, but lacked the will to oppose it publicly. "The issue before us is simple," Frank began once the meeting was called to order. "Our bylaws clearly state that dangerous animals are prohibited in Spring Valley Estates. I submit that a former police attack dog with military-grade training constitutes a dangerous animal by definition." Nancy felt Emily's hand tighten around hers as murmurs rippled through the room. Max, sensing the tension, remained perfectly composed beside them, his posture alert but unthreatening. "Before we continue," Nancy interjected, rising from her seat, "I'd like to clarify that Max was primarily a search and rescue dog, not an attack dog. Furthermore, I've invited Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a veterinarian specializing in service animals, to address any concerns about Max's temperament and training." Dr. Jenkins approached the podium with professional confidence, presenting her credentials and experience. She explained Max's background, his injury, and the remarkable bond he had formed with Emily. "In my professional assessment," she concluded, "Max poses no greater risk than any other well-trained dog. In fact, his specialized training makes him more reliable in stressful situations than the average pet." Several neighbors nodded in agreement, but Frank remained unmoved. With all due respect to the doctor's expertise, the fact remains that this animal was trained by the police department for law enforcement purposes. Such animals are conditioned to respond with aggression when triggered. "That's simply incorrect," Dr. Jenkins countered. "Canine officers are trained for controlled response, not random aggression." The debate continued with opinions divided among the residents. Margaret Wilson spoke passionately about the positive changes she'd observed in Emily. Others expressed vague concerns about safety and property values. As the discussion grew heated, Emily suddenly stood, her small voice cutting through the adult arguments. "May I show you something?" The unexpected request created a momentary lull. Association President Walter Thompson, clearly relieved by the interruption, nodded his permission. Emily walked to the center of the room, Max following at a perfect heel. With deliberate movements, she demonstrated the communication system they had developed. Hand signals, positional cues. The way Max alerted her to sounds she couldn't hear with her partial hearing loss. "Before Max," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I was afraid a lot. Afraid of missing important things because I couldn't hear them. Afraid of getting lost in conversations. Afraid of being different." She placed her hand on Max's head. He was afraid too. His body got hurt protecting someone, and then nobody wanted him anymore. The room had fallen completely silent, every adult caught in the simple wisdom of Emily's perspective. "We fixed each other," she concluded. "Please don't make us break again." Even Frank Peterson seemed momentarily disarmed by the child's sincerity. The tension in the room had shifted palpably, with several neighbors openly wiping away tears. Walter Thompson cleared his throat. "I think we've heard enough to make a determination. The bylaws do allow exceptions for service and support animals, which, he glanced at Dr. Jenkins, who nodded encouragingly, seems to apply in this case. Unless there are objections, I suggest we table this discussion and monitor the situation informally. Frank began to protest, but fell silent when Doris placed a restraining hand on his arm, shaking her head slightly. As they left the meeting, several neighbors approached to express support and admiration for Max. Margaret Wilson hugged Nancy tightly. "Thomas would be so proud," she whispered, "of all three of you." That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Nancy sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, Max lying at her feet. The evening air carried the scent of desert sage and distant rain. She thought about Thomas, about the project he'd never completed, about the invisible threads connecting past to present. "I think I understand now," she said softly to Max, who lifted his head at the sound of her voice. "Why Emily needed you. Why I needed you too." She reached down to stroke his scarred shoulder. "And maybe why you needed us." Max pressed his muzzle against her hand in silent acknowledgement of truths that transcended words, the universal language of loss and healing they had all come to understand. Neither of them could have anticipated how soon their newfound peace would be tested, or how a neighborhood summer tradition would become the crucible that would either cement their bond or shatter it beyond repair. The annual neighborhood 4th of July barbecue was a tradition dating back to the community's founding in the late 1980s. A potluck affair held in the shared park space with games for children, grilled meats contributed by the men who competed for Best Burger bragging rights, and a dazzling display of mostly legal fireworks after sunset. In previous years, Nancy had attended out of obligation rather than enthusiasm, Thomas's absence a persistent ache during community gatherings where couples predominated. This year felt different. Emily had spent the morning preparing red, white, and blue cupcakes, her confidence in the kitchen growing alongside her other developmental strides. Nancy had watched with quiet pride as her granddaughter carefully measured ingredients, Max lying patiently nearby, alert for any dropped morsels. "Do you think people will be nice to Max at the barbecue?" Emily asked, her hearing aid catching the light as she tilted her head toward Nancy. "Most will," Nancy replied honestly. "Some may need time to get used to him. Remember how we practiced?" Emily nodded solemnly. The weeks following the Homeowners Association meeting had included intensive training sessions with Dr. Jenkins, preparing Max for the sensory overload of crowded public events. They had practiced commands for creating space, maintaining calm, and disengaging from stressful interactions, skills that benefited both Max and Emily in different ways. By mid-afternoon, the community park buzzed with activity. Folding tables sagged under the weight of casseroles and desserts. Children darted between clusters of conversing adults. Lawn chairs formed irregular semicircles around the central grilling station where three men debated the merits of various barbecue techniques with near religious fervor. Nancy felt a familiar tightness in her chest as they approached, the social anxiety that had become her companion since widowhood. Emily sensed her grandmother's hesitation and reached for her hand. "It's okay, Grandma. Max will watch out for both of us." The shepherd walked beside them with ceremonial dignity, the service animal in training vest, lending him an official air that seemed to discourage most intrusive approaches. Margaret Wilson waved them over to a shady spot where she had reserved chairs. "Saved you the best seats," Margaret announced, her silver hair immaculately styled despite the Arizona heat. "Away from the speakers. Thought it might be better for both Emily and Max." Nancy squeezed her friend's hand in silent gratitude for this thoughtfulness. As they settled in, several neighbors stopped by to greet them and admire Max, who maintained perfect composure despite the chaotic environment. Even Frank Peterson limited himself to a curt nod from across the lawn, his wife Doris offering a compensatory smile as she tugged him toward the dessert table. "Your cupcakes are the hit of the party," Margaret informed Emily, who beamed with pride. Mrs. Henderson asked for your recipe." For the first hour, the gathering unfolded with surprising pleasantness. Emily joined a modified game of tag that accommodated her need to keep Max nearby, the other children having quickly adapted to the shepherd's presence as only the young can do, with unquestioning acceptance of difference. "Remarkable how well he's doing with all this stimulation," observed Dr. Jenkins, who had arrived with her husband and joined Nancy's little circle. "Most retired working dogs struggle with unpredictable environments like this." "We've been practicing," Nancy explained, watching as Max maintained a vigilant but relaxed posture near Emily's play area. "And he seems to understand when Emily needs him to be social versus when she needs him to be protective." As afternoon mellowed toward evening, the children's activities gave way to more subdued social dining. Emily returned to their table, flushed with exertion and happiness, a rare sight that filled Nancy with quiet joy. Max positioned himself between Emily's chair and the path of heaviest foot traffic, still guarding but with subtle discretion. The trouble began, as it often does, with the well-intentioned ignorance of an outsider. James Henderson's brother-in-law, David, visiting from Cincinnati, had consumed several beers and developed the particular fascination with working dogs that sometimes afflicts men with military enthusiasm, but no actual service experience. "That's a real police K-9, right?" he asked, approaching their table with the exaggerated care of someone not entirely steady. "Trained to take down bad guys?" "He's retired," Nancy replied with practiced patience. "Max was primarily a search and rescue specialist." David nodded with excessive enthusiasm. "My buddy works security with a shepherd. Says they can switch from teddy bear to killer in a split second." He made a sharp finger-snapping gesture. "Just like that." Nancy felt Max tense slightly beside Emily. Though the shepherd hadn't moved, she recognized the shift in his attention, the near imperceptible alertness that signaled his assessment of potential threat. "Max is just part of our family now," Emily said, her hand finding its way to the shepherd's fur in a calming gesture she'd mastered over their months together. Sure, David continued, either missing or ignoring the social cues to end the conversation. "But they never really stopped being what they were trained for, right? Once a police dog, always a police dog. I bet he still responds to attack commands." Dr. Jenkins intervened with professional firmness. "Actually, that's a common misconception. K-9 officers are trained with specific cues that wouldn't be accidentally triggered in casual settings." David's interest only seemed to intensify with this information. "Like what? Special German words or something? I've always wondered how that works." The conversation had attracted attention from nearby tables, creating exactly the kind of spectacle Nancy had hoped to avoid. She glanced at Emily, who had grown quiet, her expression showing the subtle withdrawal that preceded anxiety. "I think it's time for us to take a little break," Nancy suggested, standing to signal an end to the discussion. "Emily, why don't we walk Max around the perimeter for a bit?" They had nearly made their escape when David, perhaps feeling he was losing his audience, called after them. "Hey, wait, I just wanted to see what he does." "They taught us in a security seminar that these dogs respond to sudden threats." Before Nancy could intervene, David made a lunging movement toward Emily, accompanied by a loud "boo" that he clearly intended as a harmless demonstration. Several things happened in rapid sequence. Emily, startled and unable to process the sudden movement with her partial hearing, flinched backward. Max, interpreting this as a threat to his charge, moved instantly into a protective stance, not attacking but positioning himself between Emily and David with a warning rumble that carried centuries of wolfish ancestry. David stumbled backward, genuinely alarmed by the transformation in the dog's demeanor. His heel caught on an uneven patch of grass, sending him sprawling into the nearest refreshment table. Punch bowls toppled, plates clattered to the ground, and David landed with a thud that momentarily silenced all other conversation in the park. "Jesus Christ!" he exclaimed, scrambling backward with undignified haste. "That beast tried to attack me!" "Max didn't touch you," Dr. Jenkins stated firmly, helping David to his feet with professional efficiency. He was performing a blocking maneuver, exactly as he was trained to do when perceiving a threat to someone in his care. But perception had already crystallized in the startled gazes of the onlookers. Nancy watched with sinking heart as Frank Peterson hurried over, his expression vindicating every dire prediction he had made about Max's presence in their community. "This is exactly what I warned about," he announced to the gathering crowd. "Military animals don't belong in family settings. Someone could have been seriously injured." "The only thing injured is your punch bowl, Frank," Margaret interjected, attempting to diffuse the situation with humor. "And from the smell of it, that might be a blessing in disguise." A few neighbors chuckled, but the mood had shifted palpably. Parents instinctively gathered children closer. Conversations hushed and restarted with meaningful glances toward Emily and Max. Nancy felt a familiar helplessness washing over her, the same paralysis she'd experienced when the doctor had explained that despite their best efforts, Thomas's heart attack had been too massive, too devastating to survive. The feeling of watching events unfold with no power to alter their trajectory. Emily, however, had not surrendered. With a composure that belied her 8 years, she knelt beside Max, who had already stood down from his protective posture and now watched her with attentive concern. "Max didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice carrying with unexpected clarity. "That man scared me, and Max protected me. That's his job." David, now brushing punch from his shirt with exaggerated offense, scoffed. "His job? He's a dog, kid, and a dangerous one." "Actually," came a new voice from the edge of the gathering, "protecting Emily is precisely his job." Officer James Carter moved through the crowd with the natural authority of a 30-year police veteran. Though retired for nearly 2 years, he carried himself with the straight-backed posture that had once made Thomas joke that Carter had swallowed his badge. At his side, a German shepherd only slightly younger than Max watched the proceedings with professional interest. "Officer Carter," Frank acknowledged with wary respect. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us today." "Neighborhood's always been my beat, Frank, retired or not." Carter surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency. "Looks like we had a misunderstanding here." "That dog nearly attacked my brother-in-law," James Henderson protested, though with notably less conviction than David's original accusation. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "I saw what happened." Max performed exactly as he was trained to do, controlled protection without excessive force. He turned to David with a stern expression. "And you, sir, deliberately startled a child under the care of a service animal, which is approximately as wise as poking a beehive to see what happens." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the gathering. The presence of a retired police officer, particularly one with his own shepherd, had shifted the dynamic once again. "Nancy," Carter continued, addressing her directly, "I've been meaning to stop by. Been following Emily and Max's progress through Dr. Jenkins. Thomas would have been mighty proud of what you're doing." The public endorsement from a respected community figure, and one connected to Thomas, landed like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Nancy felt tears threatening and blinked them back with determined dignity. "Thank you, James," she managed. "That means a great deal." Emily, sensing the change in atmosphere, stepped forward with the social intuition that often accompanies children who navigate the world differently. "Would you like a cupcake, Officer Carter? I made them myself." This simple offer of hospitality, this child extending grace when adults had shown fear, seemed to puncture the tension like a balloon. Margaret quickly produced a surviving cupcake, and conversation gradually resumed its normal patterns. "David," thoroughly chastened by Carter's rebuke and the community's shifting response, mumbled an awkward apology before retreating to the far side of the gathering. Frank Peterson remained stonily disapproving, but, outnumbered by the changing tide of opinion, limited himself to whispered consultations with a few like-minded neighbors. As dusk settled over the park, Nancy found herself seated beside Carter, watching Emily introduce Max to Carter's shepherd, Ranger, with careful supervision from both humans. "I meant what I said," Carter told her, his voice gruff with emotion he rarely displayed. "Thomas had this vision for dogs like Max, giving them purpose after their service years. Department thought it was too expensive, too complicated, but Thomas always said these dogs give everything for us. We owe them a second chapter." Nancy studied the weathered face of her husband's former colleague, seeing the weight of shared history in the lines around his eyes. "James mentioned something about a program Thomas was developing." Carter nodded. "Second chapter. That's what he called it. Had proposals written up, training protocols designed. After his heart attack." He trailed off, watching the shepherds cautiously circling each other, establishing their hierarchical understanding. "Well, priorities shifted. Budget cuts, the usual excuses." "I had no idea," Nancy admitted. "Thomas never mentioned it." "He wanted to surprise you," Carter replied with a sad smile. "Said he was going to retire in 2 years and run the program full-time. Had it all planned out." The revelation settled into Nancy's heart. Another piece of Thomas restored to her. Another connection to the man whose absence had defined her life for 5 years. She watched Emily demonstrating to Carter how Max alerted her to sounds she couldn't hear, the shepherd's devoted attention to his young handler evident even from a distance. "They're remarkable together," Carter observed. "It's like they speak the same language." "They do," Nancy confirmed. "They both know what it's like to navigate a world that wasn't designed for them." As darkness fell completely, the first whistling fireworks ascended into the night sky, bursting into cascades of color that drew appreciative ahs from the gathered families. Nancy tensed, remembering Max's previous distress during fireworks. But Emily was prepared. At the first explosion, she immediately implemented their practiced routine, creating a safe space beneath a picnic table draped with a blanket, using noise-canceling headphones designed for both of them, and employing the deep pressure techniques Dr. Jenkins had taught them. From their sheltered vantage point, Nancy watched her granddaughter comforting the shepherd who had appointed himself her protector, their roles momentarily reversed. In that simple tableau, child and dog supporting each other through mutual distress, Nancy saw the essence of Thomas's vision made manifest. The moment's poignancy was interrupted by Frank Peterson's voice, pitched to carry over the fireworks to a small cluster of concerned parents. "Just a matter of time before something serious happens. Military dogs with PTSD, traumatized children, it's a recipe for disaster. I've already contacted Animal Control about conducting a formal assessment." The words pierced Nancy's momentary peace like physical blows. She met Carter's gaze, seeing her own concern reflected there. "Frank's got a cousin on the county board," Carter said quietly. "If he pushes for an official review—" Nancy nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. Max's future, the delicate balance they had established as a family, hung by a thread that Frank Peterson seemed determined to sever. As the fireworks reached their crescendo overhead, Nancy realized that their triumph at the homeowners' meeting had been merely a skirmish. The real battle for Max's place in their family, and for the legacy Thomas had entrusted to her without her knowledge, was only beginning. In the colored light of exploding fireworks, Emily met her grandmother's gaze across the distance. Something in the child's expression, a determination beyond her years, told Nancy that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. All 3 of them. The official notice from Maricopa County Animal Control arrived 3 days after the 4th of July barbecue. a sterile, bureaucratic document that belied its power to shatter their carefully constructed life together. Nancy's hands trembled slightly as she read the cold, impersonal language. Following multiple community concerns regarding a former police K9 German Shepherd, male, approximately 9 years old, residing at 1427 Saguaro Lane, a mandatory behavioral assessment has been scheduled for July 12th at 10 a.m. The animal must be present. Failure to comply may result in immediate removal and impoundment pending review. Nancy set the letter on the kitchen counter, her mind racing through potential strategies and defenses. She had faced bureaucratic battles before: the labyrinthine process of securing Thomas's pension benefits, the insurance companies that had initially resisted covering Emily's specialized hearing treatments. But those fights had been conducted through phone calls and paperwork. This threatened something immediate and irreplaceable: Max's presence in their home. Emily entered the kitchen, Max padding silently beside her. The shepherd's awareness of human emotional states, a skill honed through years of police work, made him instantly alert to Nancy's distress. He approached, pressing his muzzle gently against her hand in a gesture that had become his characteristic offering of comfort. "What's wrong, Grandma?" Emily asked, her perception of emotional undercurrents having grown remarkably acute during her time with Max. Nancy considered sugarcoating the situation but quickly abandoned the idea. Their family had been built on honesty even when difficult. "There's going to be a hearing about Max," she explained, kneeling to Emily's level. "Some people still think he might not be safe in a home with a child." Emily's face crumpled momentarily before resolving into a determined frown. "But that's not true. Max protects me. He's never hurt anyone." "I know, sweetheart. But we need to prove that to some officials who don't know him like we do." The following days unfolded in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Dr. Jenkins arrived the morning after the notice, reviewing the assessment protocols with the grave focus of a general planning battle strategy. "They'll evaluate him on multiple fronts," she explained, spreading documents across Nancy's dining table. "Reaction to sudden stimuli, resource guarding, response to strangers approaching his family members, standard canine temperament testing, but with additional scrutiny because of his working background." "He'll pass all that," Emily insisted from her position on the floor beside Max. "He's the best dog ever." Dr. Jenkins smiled gently. "He is exceptional, Emily." "But these evaluations can be stressful, and they sometimes trigger responses in even the most well-adjusted animals." She turned to Nancy with a more sober expression. "The evaluator assigned to your case is Clayton Williams. He has a reputation for being particularly stringent with former working dogs." "Meaning?" Nancy pressed. "Meaning he believes military and police dogs should never be rehomed to civilian families, period." Dr. Jenkins sighed. "He's had some influence in drafting county regulations on the matter." The news felt like a physical weight settling onto Nancy's shoulders. "So we're facing a biased evaluation from the start." "Unfortunately, yes. And there's something else." Dr. Jenkins hesitated, her professional composure momentarily faltering. "I've been hearing rumors that Frank Peterson's cousin on the county board has been pushing for stricter enforcement of retired service animal regulations. This may be part of a larger agenda." Nancy felt a cold anger replacing her initial anxiety. The prospect of Max being taken, becoming another victim of bureaucratic indifference and personal agendas, awakened something fierce and protective within her. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about the family they had become, about Thomas's unrealized dream, about Emily's hard-won progress. "Then we prepare," she said with quiet determination. "Every scenario, every test. We show them exactly who Max is." The days before the hearing passed in intensive preparation. Officer Carter brought Ranger for supervised interaction sessions, helping Max practice calm responses to other dogs. Dr. Jenkins recruited colleagues to act as strangers, approaching Emily suddenly while Max learned to alert without aggression. Even Margaret Wilson contributed, her background in community theater proving unexpectedly useful as she played the role of an intrusive official with convincing authority. Throughout it all, Emily remained their emotional center, steady and certain in her bond with Max when adult doubts threatened to overwhelm. "He understands what we're doing," she assured Nancy one evening as they reviewed hand signals for the 100th time. "He knows it's important." The morning of the hearing dawned with the merciless clarity of Arizona summer, the sky an unblemished blue that seemed to mock their inner turmoil. Nancy dressed with deliberate care, choosing the same navy suit she had worn to Thomas's funeral and every important meeting since, her armor against an indifferent world. Emily appeared in her doorway as Nancy fastened her pearl earrings, the girl already dressed in the outfit they had selected together. A simple blue dress with her best shoes, her hearing aid freshly polished, her hair neatly braided. "You look very grown up," Nancy observed, her heart clenching at how small her granddaughter still appeared despite her composed demeanor. "I want them to take me seriously," Emily replied with simple dignity. "For Max." The County Animal Services building loomed institutional and forbidding, a low, gray structure surrounded by chain link and the distant chorus of kenneled dogs. In the parking lot, Nancy was surprised to find a small gathering waiting. Dr. Jenkins, professionally attired with a portfolio of medical records, Officer Carter in his dress uniform despite his retired status, Margaret Wilson clutching a folder of community testimonials she had gathered. "We thought you might want some support," Margaret explained, embracing Nancy briefly. Inside, the fluorescent-lit waiting area amplified every sound, the squeak of chairs, the hum of ancient air conditioning, the occasional bark from unseen animals in back rooms. Max sat perfectly at attention between Nancy and Emily, his training evident in every line of his body despite the stress Nancy could detect in the slight tension around his eyes. Clayton Williams entered precisely at 10:00 a.m., a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and the rigid posture of former military. His gaze swept over their assembled group with professional detachment, lingering briefly on Max before settling on Nancy. "Mrs. Roberts, I'm Officer Williams, County Animal Behavioral Specialist." His tone matched his appearance, clipped, efficient, emotionless. "I see you've brought quite the entourage. The assessment is typically conducted with just the animal and its owners. These individuals have professional insights relevant to Max's case," Nancy replied, matching his formality. "Dr. Jenkins is his veterinarian with specialized experience in service animals. Officer Carter worked with my late husband in the K-9 unit and can speak to Max's training background." Williams consulted his clipboard with a slight frown. "The paperwork indicates this animal was Officer Morrison's partner, not your husband's." "That's correct," Nancy acknowledged. "But my husband, Officer Thomas Roberts, was developing a program for retiring K-9s. Max was part of the same unit." A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed Williams' face before his professional mask resumed. "I see. Well, we have a process to follow. We'll begin with basic temperament testing, then move to specific scenario evaluations." What followed was the most grueling 3 hours of Nancy's life since Thomas's funeral. Williams put Max through a comprehensive battery of tests, evaluating his response to loud noises, sudden movements, food being removed mid-meal, strangers approaching Emily, territorial challenges from another dog, a stocky Labrador handled by a department assistant. Through it all, Max performed with impeccable discipline, demonstrating the years of training that had made him an elite working dog. He alerted to potential threats without aggression, created space without intimidation, protected without excessive force. Emily worked alongside him with remarkable poise, executing their practiced signals and commands with a confidence that belied her age. Dr. Jenkins provided running commentary, explaining the nuances of Max's responses to Williams, translating the language of canine behavior into terms that highlighted his exceptional control and appropriate reactions. Yet, as the assessment continued, Nancy could sense Williams's determination to find fault. His scenarios grew increasingly provocative. A male assistant grabbing Emily's arm without warning, a recording of gunshots played at startling volume, food offered with unfamiliar medication hidden inside that Max appropriately refused. "He's pushing beyond standard protocols," Dr. Jenkins whispered to Nancy during a brief water break. "These are stress tests designed for active-duty K9s, not family pets." The final evaluation took place in an outdoor training yard. Williams instructed Emily to walk Max on leash past a series of distractions. Another dog, a person behaving erratically, food scattered on the ground. As they completed the circuit, returning to where Nancy and the others waited, Williams deliberately dropped a heavy metal clipboard directly behind Emily. The clatter was sudden and jarring. Emily, unable to process the sound clearly with her hearing impairment, startled visibly. Max immediately moved into alert posture, not lunging, not barking, but positioning himself between Emily and the perceived threat, his attention entirely focused on Williams. "Aggressive stance," Williams noted aloud, making a mark on his evaluation form. "Subject displays protective response that could escalate to confrontation." "That's a standard blocking position, not aggression," Officer Carter objected, his professional expertise evident in his tone. "Any K9 in the county would have responded similarly or more assertively." Max showed remarkable restraint. Williams regarded Carter with cool assessment. "Former officers often develop emotional attachments to working dogs that cloud objective evaluation, Officer Carter. And some evaluators bring predetermined biases to their assessments, Officer Williams," Carter countered evenly. The tension in the room crystallized, two men with decades of service regarding each other across a philosophical divide that seemed unbridgeable. Emily, sensing the adult conflict but not fully understanding its implications, did something unexpected. She removed her hearing aid and held it out toward Williams. "This helps me hear," she said, her speech slightly less modulated without the device's feedback. "But it doesn't fix everything. Sometimes I miss things like your clipboard falling. Max helps me hear the world better." She replaced the aid carefully. "He's not just a dog to me. He's my ears when mine don't work right." The simple honesty of her explanation created a moment of silence that even Williams seemed reluctant to break. In that pause, Nancy saw a fleeting opportunity. "Officer Williams," she began carefully, "my husband believed that dogs like Max, animals who had given everything in service, deserved dignified second chapters. Not warehousing, not euthanasia when they could no longer perform at peak level. Thomas died before he could implement his program officially. But in our home with Emily, Max has found exactly the purpose Thomas envisioned for retired canines." William's expression remained impassive, but Nancy thought she detected a minute softening around his eyes. "Mrs. Roberts, while I appreciate your personal connection to this situation, my responsibility is to community safety, not sentimental considerations." "Then consider this," Dr. Jenkins interjected, opening her portfolio. "I've been documenting Max and Emily's interaction as part of a study on communication between service animals and hearing-impaired children. The preliminary findings suggest that dogs with Max's specific training background may be uniquely suited to assist children with auditory processing challenges." She extended a folder of data. "This isn't sentimentality, it's emerging science." Williams accepted the folder but set it aside without opening it. I'll review all submitted materials before making my determination. He consulted his clipboard one final time. The assessment is complete. You'll receive official notification of my findings within 5 business days. Until then, the animal remains under conditional supervision. No public outings, no interaction with other neighborhood children. As they gathered their belongings to leave, Williams added, almost as an afterthought, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Roberts, your husband's ideas about canine retirement weren't without merit. The department's handling of these animals after service has been inadequate." This small acknowledgement, the first crack in Williams' professional facade, provided Nancy with a fragile hope as they left the building. In the parking lot, their small support group clustered together, exchanging subdued assessments of the evaluation. "He's going to recommend removal," Dr. Jenkins said quietly, her usual optimism notably absent. "Williams has never approved a former police canine for civilian adoption. Not once in 15 cases I've tracked." "There has to be an appeal process," Nancy insisted, watching Emily kneeling beside Max, whispering reassurances to the shepherd who had performed so valiantly throughout the ordeal. Officer Carter nodded grimly. "There is, but it's through the same department, often reviewed by the same officials. The system is designed to manage risk, not recognize exceptions." The drive home passed in heavy silence. Even Emily, subdued by the weight of adult concerns she could sense, but not fully comprehend. Max maintained his vigilant position beside her in the back seat, occasionally pressing his muzzle against her hand as if offering reassurance that transcended species. 5 days passed in excruciating slowness. Nancy found herself starting at every approaching vehicle, every official-looking envelope in the mail. Emily grew quieter, spending hours with Max in the backyard, their private communication system seeming to intensify as if preparing for separation. On the morning of the 5th day, Nancy opened the front door to collect the newspaper and found Clayton Williams standing on her porch, uniform impeccable despite the early hour. "Officer Williams," she managed, her throat constricting with sudden fear. "We weren't expecting you in person." "Some matters warrant direct communication, Mrs. Roberts." His expression remained professionally neutral. "May I come in?" In the living room, Emily emerged from her bedroom at the sound of unfamiliar voices, Max a shadow at her side. The shepherd recognized Williams immediately, his posture alert but controlled, the consummate professional even in his own home. Williams removed his hat, holding it formally before him. "I've completed my evaluation and submitted my official recommendation to the department." He paused, meeting Nancy's gaze directly. "Based on comprehensive assessment, I've determined that the K9 designated Max represents a potential public safety concern in a civilian residential setting, particularly with a minor present." Nancy felt the room tilt slightly, her vision narrowing as the clinical words registered their devastating meaning. Beside her, Emily made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a wounded intake of breath that seemed to physical hurt Nancy's heart. "The department has authorized immediate removal pending final disposition," Williams continued, his tone unchanged. "I'm prepared to transport the animal to county facilities today." "No," Emily's voice broke the terrible silence, small but fierce. "You can't take him. He belongs with us." Williams turned to the child with the same detached professionalism he had maintained throughout. "I understand this is difficult, young lady, but my responsibility is to ensure community safety based on objective evaluation, not emotional considerations." "Your evaluation wasn't objective," Nancy found herself saying, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "You've never approved a former police canine for civilian adoption, not once in 15 cases. That suggests bias, not objectivity." A flicker of surprise crossed Williams' face. perhaps at her knowledge of his record, perhaps at her willingness to challenge him directly. Mrs. Roberts, I assure you each case is evaluated on its individual merits. Then explain how a dog who passed every standard assessment, who has never shown inappropriate aggression, who serves a vital function for a hearing-impaired child, fails to merit approval. Nancy stepped forward, years of accommodating widowhood falling away as she advocated for her family. This isn't about Max's behavior. It's about a system that discards loyal service animals when they can no longer perform at peak capacity. Williams's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something more complex beneath. Not the bureaucratic automaton she had assumed, but a man wrestling with his own convictions. Mrs. Roberts, I don't make these determinations lightly. These animals are trained as living weapons. Their capabilities don't simply disappear when they retire. No, Nancy agreed, finding unexpected strength in the terrible moment. Their capabilities don't disappear. They evolve. They adapt. They find new purpose, just as my husband believed they could. Emily moved to stand beside her grandmother, Max maintaining perfect heel position. The tableau they presented, elderly woman, hearing-impaired child, battle-scarred shepherd, seemed to arrest Williams's attention. Please, Emily said simply. He's family. In the heavy silence that followed, Williams studied the three of them with an unreadable expression. Then, with deliberate movements, he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew an official envelope. As I was saying, he continued, his tone subtly altered, based on my evaluation, K9 Max represents a potential concern in a civilian setting. He paused, extending the envelope to Nancy. Unless supervised under specific conditional parameters as outlined in this modified service animal designation. Nancy stared at the envelope, uncomprehending. The department has provisionally approved reclassification of K9 Max as a service animal in training for hearing assistance, subject to quarterly evaluation and completion of a certified training program. William's expression remained professional, but something in his eyes had changed. Dr. Jenkins has agreed to oversee the certification process and documentation. You're not taking him? Emily whispered, hope and disbelief warring in her voice. Not today, Williams confirmed. Possibly not at all if the conditions are met. He returned his hat to his head with formal precision. The paperwork requires signatures. I'll wait while you review it. As Nancy opened the envelope with trembling fingers, Williams added in a lower voice, Your husband's program proposal is still in the department archives. I reviewed it last night. He was ahead of his time in many respects. The documents inside outlined a stringent but achievable path forward. Training requirements, behavioral benchmarks, reporting protocols. Not ideal, perhaps, but infinitely preferable to the separation they had feared moments before. As Nancy signed where indicated, she felt Emily leaning against her side, the child's body gradually relaxing from its terrified rigidity. Max remained at attention, watching Williams with the careful assessment of a fellow professional, neither trusting nor hostile, simply aware. Williams accepted the signed documents, tucking them precisely into his folder. Quarterly evaluations begin in October. Dr. Jenkins has the full requirements. He paused at the door, something almost human breaking through his official demeanor. For what it's worth, Mrs. Roberts, in 15 previous cases, I've never seen a bond like the one between your granddaughter and that dog. I hope I'm not making a mistake. After he left, the three of them remained in the living room, the reprieve so unexpected that it felt fragile, dreamlike. Emily knelt beside Max, burying her face in his fur as tears of relief finally came. The shepherd pressed against her, solid and real and present, still theirs, at least for now. Nancy sank into her armchair, emotional exhaustion washing over her in waves. They had survived this battle, but the war wasn't over. The conditional approval meant months of scrutiny, evaluations, constant proving and reproving of Max's appropriateness in their home. Yet as she watched Emily and Max together, the child's tears gradually giving way to smiles, the shepherd's protective presence unwavering, Nancy felt a strange peace settling alongside her exhaustion. Thomas had believed in second chances, in new purpose after service ended. In their own way, all three of them were living his vision, finding meaning in what remained, not what was lost. The path ahead would be challenging, the victory incomplete. But for today, their family remained whole. And sometimes, Nancy reflected as Emily's laughter finally broke the tension of the terrible morning, that temporary wholeness was all anyone could ask for in an imperfect world. William's conditional approval bought them time but introduced a rigorous new reality. Nancy created a dedicated folder for the documentation requirements, adding dividers for training logs, behavioral assessments, and incident reports. The binder quickly became a daily ritual, recording Max's responses to various stimuli, noting Emily's progress with the specialized commands Dr. Jenkins was teaching them, documenting their incremental steps toward official service animal certification. "It's like having homework every day forever," Emily observed one evening as Nancy methodically completed the daily log. "Sometimes keeping what matters requires extra effort," Nancy replied, her pen moving steadily across the form. The paperwork was tedious, but each completed page represented another day with Max safely in their home. August brought the start of a new school year, and with it, fresh challenges. Emily would be entering third grade, a transition made more complex by the question of Max's role in her educational setting. Principal Dorothy Miller had initially resisted having a dog on campus at all, let alone a former police K-9 with a conditional service designation. "The liability issues alone give me heartburn," she'd told Nancy during their preterm meeting, adjusting her reading glasses with nervous energy. And frankly, Mrs. Roberts, after that incident at the community barbecue, several parents have expressed concerns. Nancy had anticipated this resistance. She opened the binder she'd prepared containing Dr. Jenkins's assessment, documentation of Emily's improved academic performance when working with Max, and, most persuasively, a letter from the district's legal counsel confirming Emily's right to reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. "Max helps Emily process auditory information in complex sound environments," Nancy explained. "The classroom can be overwhelming for a child with hearing processing challenges. His alerts help her focus on the teacher rather than background noise." Principal Miller skimmed the documents with a frown that gradually softened into reluctant consideration. "I suppose we could implement a trial period, limited hours, specific conditions." By the second week of school, Max had become something of a celebrity among the students. His dignified presence beside Emily's desk, his perfect behavior during transitions between classes, and his remarkable ability to alert her to important announcements over the intercom system made him an object of fascination rather than fear. Emily flourished with her canine partner at school. Her participation in class discussions increased dramatically, and for the first time, she began forming tentative friendships with classmates who were drawn first to Max and then, by extension, to the quiet girl who commanded his complete devotion. "The arrangement is working better than I anticipated," Principal Miller admitted during their September review. Emily's teacher reports significant improvement in her engagement and confidence. Not everyone shared this positive assessment. Frank Peterson had been conspicuously absent from neighborhood gatherings since the 4th of July incident, but his campaign against Max continued through proxies and bureaucratic channels. Nancy received notices about fence height requirements, leash violations allegedly reported by concerned citizens, and anonymous complaints about barking. the last particularly absurd since Max rarely vocalized at all. "Frank's making himself scarce but keeping the pressure on," Margaret informed Nancy during their weekly coffee meetup. "Word is he's still in regular contact with someone at Animal Control, waiting for any slip-up he can use." Nancy absorbed this intelligence with outward calm, though inwardly she felt the constant strain of living under scrutiny. "We're doing everything by the book. Williams' requirements, Dr. Jenkins' training program, school protocols. There's nothing for Frank to find." "Don't underestimate a man with too much time and a grudge," Margaret warned, stirring her coffee with uncharacteristic solemnity, especially one who feels publicly embarrassed. This warning proved prescient when in late September Nancy received an official notice regarding their first quarterly evaluation, scheduled not with Dr. Jenkins as originally planned, but with Clayton Williams himself. "He's specifically requested to handle your case personally," Dr. Jenkins explained when Nancy called in alarm. "It's unusual, but within his authority." "Is this Frank's doing?" Nancy asked, watching through the kitchen window as Emily practiced scent-tracking exercises with Max in the backyard, one of the advanced skills they'd been developing for his service certification. "Possibly," Dr. Jenkins acknowledged. "Or Williams may genuinely want to monitor Max's progress himself. Either way, we'll be thoroughly prepared." The evaluation, held at the county facility where they'd first faced Williams, proceeded with mechanical precision. Williams ran Max through a series of increasingly complex scenarios, testing his responses to sudden stimuli, his alerts to sounds Emily couldn't hear clearly, his behavior around other animals. Throughout, the shepherd performed with impeccable control, demonstrating the weeks of consistent training they'd undertaken. As Williams reviewed their documentation, his expression remained professionally neutral, offering no hint of his assessment. "The records appear comprehensive," he noted, turning pages in their meticulously maintained binder. "Daily logs complete, training progression well documented. Max has been responding exceptionally well to the service animal protocols," Dr. Jenkins added. "His previous training actually accelerates the process. He understands the concept of consistent response to specific triggers." Williams made a non-committal sound, continuing his review in silence that stretched Nancy's nerves to breaking point. Finally, he closed the binder and looked up. "Based on this evaluation, K9 Max's conditional status will continue as established," he stated formally. "Next assessment in December." Relief flooded through Nancy, though she maintained her composed exterior. "Thank you, Officer Williams." As they gathered their materials to leave, Williams added something unexpected. "Mrs. Roberts, I received 3 separate complaints about your animal in the past month. Barking disturbances, aggressive posturing toward passers-by, running loose in the neighborhood." His tone remained neutral, but his eyes held something like warning. "I investigated these complaints personally before today's evaluation." Nancy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned room. "And your findings?" "The alleged incidents occurred while your granddaughter was verifiably in school with the animal at her side, witnessed by teachers and documented in your logs." Williams' expression remained impassive. "I've marked the complaints as unsubstantiated." The implication was clear. Someone was actively fabricating evidence against Max. Nancy met Williams' gaze directly. "Thank you for your thoroughness, officer." He nodded slightly. "Documentation matters, Mrs. Roberts. Continue maintaining detailed records." As October painted the desert landscape with subtle shifts of color, Nancy found herself increasingly drawn to Thomas's old files, boxes of papers she'd preserved but rarely examined after his death. Among them she discovered a folder labeled simply Second Chapter, containing his draft proposals for the K9 retirement program. Reading Thomas's words, his methodical outlines, His passionate arguments for honoring canine service through meaningful second careers felt like having a conversation with him across the years. His vision had been remarkably comprehensive: training protocols for transitioning working dogs to support roles, placement criteria for matching dogs with appropriate families, ongoing support structures for handlers and adopters alike. He had it all figured out, Nancy murmured to herself, tracing his handwriting with gentle fingers. 5 years ago, he saw exactly what Max and Emily would need today. The discovery of these documents coincided with an unexpected visit from Officer Carter, who arrived one Saturday morning with his Shepherd Ranger and a cardboard box of faded photographs. "Found these cleaning out my garage," he explained as they sat at Nancy's kitchen table, Emily and the two shepherds playing in the backyard. "Training photos from when Thomas was developing his program ideas. Thought you might want them." The photographs captured moments from canine training sessions, handlers working with their partners, Thomas demonstrating techniques, dogs at various stages of skill development. In several images, Nancy recognized a younger Max working with Officer Morrison. "Thomas believed these dogs deserved more than being discarded after their service years," Carter said, watching Nancy sort through the images. "Department called it sentimental thinking, not practical resource management." "Bureaucratic language for throwing away loyal partners," Nancy observed with unexpected bitterness. Carter nodded grimly. "Thomas kept pushing anyway. Had 5 or 6 retired K9s he was working with informally, proving they could transition to other roles." He hesitated. "You know, there are other handlers who've retired their partners without good options. Word's getting around about what you're doing with Max and Emily." Nancy looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean people are watching. Officers who care about their partners' futures. Handlers facing retirement or transfer who can't keep their dogs." Carter's weathered face reflected decades of service and the complicated emotions that accompanied it. "You're becoming something of a proof of concept for Thomas's vision." The conversation planted a seed that took root in Nancy's thoughts over the following weeks. She found herself revisiting Thomas's proposal documents, imagining what might have been, and perhaps what still could be. One evening in late October, as Nancy helped Emily with homework at the kitchen table, Max suddenly raised his head from his customary position at Emily's feet. His ears pricked forward, body tensing slightly, his alert posture that signaled someone approaching. Moments later, a knock sounded at the front door. Max rose smoothly, positioning himself slightly ahead of Emily as Nancy went to answer. Not aggressive, but attentive, his training evident in every line of his body. The visitor was a surprise: Clayton Williams, out of uniform in civilian clothes, standing awkwardly on their porch. "Officer Williams," Nancy greeted him, unable to mask her confusion at this unexpected appearance. "Mrs. Roberts." He nodded stiffly. "I apologize for the unannounced visit. I was hoping to speak with you privately on a matter related to, but not officially connected to, your case." Nancy invited him in with cautious courtesy. Emily, sensing the significance of his presence, remained at the table with Max, watchful beside her. Williams declined Nancy's offer of coffee, his discomfort in this social context evident in his rigid posture. "Mrs. Roberts, I've been reviewing your husband's proposal for the K9 retirement program, his second chapter initiative." Nancy's surprise must have shown on her face, for Williams continued with uncharacteristic hesitation. "After our last evaluation, I became curious about the program he had envisioned. The department archives contained his complete proposal. I've recently rediscovered his documents myself," Nancy acknowledged, curious where this conversation was heading. Williams nodded, his hands clasped before him in a posture that suggested internal struggle more than official business. "Mrs. Roberts, I've spent 23 years in law enforcement, 17 working directly with service animals. I've handled 4 K9 partners myself." His voice softened slightly. "My last partner, Rex, was retired after a warehouse explosion damaged his hearing. Department protocol dictated he be euthanized if no handler adopted him. Understanding dawned slowly. "You took him," Nancy guessed. "I did. Against department recommendation at the time. They considered him a liability, a partially deaf dog with specialized attack training." William's professional facade cracked further, revealing the man beneath the uniform. "Rex lived with my family for 7 years after retirement. Gentlest dog with my children you could imagine. Passed 3 years ago." The revelation of this personal history, this unexpected common ground, shifted something in Nancy's perception of the rigid officer who had held Max's fate in his hands. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked quietly. William straightened, reclaiming some of his official demeanor. "Because I believe your husband's program had merit, because what you're doing with Max and Emily demonstrates exactly what Thomas Roberts envisioned, giving these animals purpose beyond their service years." He hesitated. "And because there's another retired K-9 facing euthanasia next week if placement isn't found." The statement hung in the air between them, not quite a request, not quite a challenge, but loaded with implication. "I'm a grandmother raising a hearing-impaired child on a fixed income," Nancy said carefully. "We've made this work with Max, but—" "I'm not suggesting you take another dog," Williams interrupted. "I'm suggesting something larger." He reached into his jacket, withdrawing a folder. "I've drafted a proposal to revive your husband's program on a limited trial basis. 3 retired K-9s placed with specially selected families with training support and regular monitoring." Nancy accepted the folder with stunned silence. "The department has tentatively approved a pilot program," Williams continued, "with appropriate leadership and oversight." The implication became clear. "You want me to run this program? You've already proven the concept works with Max and Emily. You understand the documentation requirements, the training protocols. Dr. Jenkins has agreed to provide veterinary oversight." Williams met her gaze directly. "Your husband saw the need. You've demonstrated the solution." The proposition was simultaneously overwhelming and strangely inevitable, as if Thomas had been guiding events toward this moment from beyond. Nancy glanced toward Emily and Max, still watching from the kitchen table with quiet attention. "I would need help," she said finally. "Resources, training facilities. The department can provide limited resources for the pilot. Officer Carter has offered his expertise in training space behind his property." Williams almost smiled, a subtle softening of his usually stern expression. "There are more people who believe in this than you might think, Mrs. Roberts." That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Nancy sat on the back porch with Max beside her, contemplating the turn her life had taken. At 67, widowed and responsible for a special needs child, she had never imagined becoming the director of a K-9 retirement program. Yet as she reviewed Williams's proposal in the gentle glow of the porch light, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Max rested his head on her knee, his amber eyes reflecting the soft light. She stroked his scarred shoulder, considering the journey that had brought this battle-worn warrior into their lives, the seeming coincidences that now appeared more like destiny. "Thomas always did play the long game," she murmured to Max. "I think he'd be pleased with how his chess pieces are moving, even without him at the board." The following morning, Nancy called Williams to accept his proposal, with one significant condition. The program needs to be named after Thomas. He's the one who saw the potential in these dogs when everyone else saw liabilities. Williams agreed without hesitation. The Thomas Roberts Second Chapter Program. Its appropriate recognition. Events moved with surprising speed after that decision. Within 2 weeks, Nancy found herself standing in Carter's expansive backyard, converted into a training area with equipment donated by sympathetic K-9 officers. Beside her stood a nervous-looking young mother with a cochlear implant and her son who had been born deaf. Before them, Williams and Carter worked with a Belgian Malinois named Sargent, a bomb detection specialist whose career had ended when shrapnel damaged his right foreleg. "He's being assessed for hearing assistance work," Nancy explained to the family. "His alert behaviors are already well established. We're just redirecting them to sounds that would be relevant for your home environment." Emily, who had appointed herself assistant trainer, demonstrated with Max how the communication system worked. "He tells me when someone's at the door, or when the timer goes off, or when a car pulls up outside," she explained with the confidence of an expert. "And I can tell him what I need without talking sometimes, which is good when my hearing aid batteries die." As October melted into November, the pilot program expanded cautiously. A retired military shepherd named Apollo was placed with a veteran suffering from PTSD. Carter discovered a former tracking dog languishing in a county facility 3 hours away and arranged transfer to their program. Dr. Jenkins documented each placement, building a body of evidence supporting Thomas's original vision. Nancy's dining room transformed into an operations center, walls lined with training schedules, placement assessments, and progress reports. Emily threw herself into the role of junior trainer with unexpected skill, her natural affinity for communication with the dogs becoming an asset to the program. "She has a gift," Dr. Jenkins observed as they watched Emily working with Sargent, guiding him through scent discrimination exercises. "She understands them intuitively, probably because she's had to develop heightened awareness of nonverbal communication herself." The growing success of the program didn't go unnoticed in the community. Local news featured a small segment on their work, focusing on the touching story of Apollo helping his veteran handler navigate public spaces after years of isolation. Carter's connections brought interest from other K-9 units facing retirement decisions for their animals. Even Frank Peterson's opposition seemed to waver in the face of positive public reception. Margaret reported that he had been conspicuously silent at recent homeowners' meetings when the subject of Max arose. "Public opinion shifted," she told Nancy during their coffee meetup. "Hard to maintain a crusade when everyone else sees a heartwarming success story." Yet amid these positive developments, Nancy remained vigilant. Williams' warning about fabricated complaints had revealed the lengths to which opposition might go. She maintained meticulous records, insisted on impeccable behavior from all program dogs in public settings, and prepared for their December evaluation with the thoroughness of a general planning a critical campaign. The truth emerged unexpectedly on a crisp November morning when Nancy was reviewing applications for their next potential placement. A knock at the door revealed Doris Peterson standing awkwardly on the porch, her hands twisting nervously before her. "Nancy," she began hesitantly, "I need to speak with you. About Frank. About what he's been doing." Inside, over coffee she barely touched, Doris revealed the extent of her husband's obsession. "He's been documenting every movement of that dog for months. Photographing from the window, keeping logs of when you go out, when you return." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "He filed those false reports to animal control." "I found the copies in his desk." "Why?" Nancy asked, genuinely bewildered by the intensity of this campaign. "What does Frank have against Max specifically?" Doris stared into her untouched coffee. "It's not about the dog, not really. It's about control. About being right." She hesitated. "And I think it reminds him of something he'd rather forget." "What do you mean?" "Frank was in Vietnam. Early days, before the major deployments. They used dogs for perimeter security, tracking." Doris looked up, her eyes troubled. "There was an incident. Frank never talks about it directly, but when he's had too much to drink, he mentions a handler and dog who saved his unit." says they were left behind during an evacuation. Understanding dawned slowly. Survivor's guilt, Nancy murmured. I think seeing Max, a military-trained dog who was injured in service, brings it all back, the debt he feels he can never repay. Doris shook her head sadly. It doesn't excuse what he's doing, but it explains the intensity, Nancy finished. Doris nodded, then reached into her purse and withdrew a USB drive. Frank's documentation, all the false reports, the dates, everything he's compiled to use against you. She placed it on the table between them. I can't be part of this anymore. Not after seeing what you're doing with those other dogs and families. The revelation left Nancy with a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at the deliberate campaign against them, sympathy for the wounded history behind it, uncertainty about how to proceed with this sensitive information. That evening, she shared the discovery with Officer Carter during their weekly program review. I have evidence of falsified complaints that could probably get Peterson in legal trouble, she concluded, but that seems unnecessarily destructive. Carter considered this thoughtfully. Sometimes, the best way to disarm an opponent is to invite them inside your defenses, he suggested. Make them part of the solution instead of the problem. This philosophy, so characteristic of Thomas's approach to conflict, guided Nancy's next steps. Rather than confronting Frank with evidence of his actions, she composed a carefully worded invitation. The Thomas Roberts Second Chapter Program cordially requests your attendance at our December graduation ceremony for our first class of placed K-9s. Your perspective as a concerned community member would be valuable as we continue refining our protocols and safety measures. The note, hand-delivered to the Petersons' mailbox, represented either a tremendous risk or an inspired strategy. Nancy wasn't entirely sure which, but as she watched Max and Emily practicing their demonstration routine for the ceremony, she felt Thomas would have approved of offering reconciliation before retribution. December arrived with cooling temperatures and holiday decorations appearing throughout the neighborhood. The graduation ceremony, scheduled for the second Saturday of the month, had expanded from a simple certification event to a community celebration. The local veterans group offered their meeting hall, complete with stage and seating for 50. Officer Carter arranged for several active-duty K-9 units to attend in official capacity, lending departmental legitimacy to the proceedings. On the morning of the ceremony, as Nancy helped Emily into her carefully selected outfit, she felt the weight of Thomas's absence with particular sharpness. He should have been there to see his vision realized, to witness the transformation of retired warriors into healing companions. "Grandpa would be super proud today," Emily said suddenly, as if reading Nancy's thoughts. "Of Max, and you, and everything." "Yes," Nancy agreed, throat tightening unexpectedly. He would be. They arrived early to help with final preparations. The hall had been transformed with modest decorations. Photographs of the program dogs with their new families, a display of K-9 equipment through the years, a memorial table with Thomas's service photograph and program proposal documents. As attendees began arriving, program participants, veterinary staff, supporting officers, and their families, Nancy watched the door with nervous anticipation. Williams appeared in dress uniform, nodding approval at the professional presentation of the event. Dr. Jenkins arrived with additional documentation for their official files. Margaret Wilson bustled in with homemade refreshments and moral support. The ceremony began precisely on schedule, Williams delivering opening remarks about the program's origins and purpose. Nancy, seated beside Emily and Max in the front row, scanned the audience one final time, noting with resignation the empty seats where she had hoped the Petersons might sit. Then, just as Carter took the podium to introduce the graduating teams, the door at the back of the hall opened quietly. Frank Peterson entered alone, standing awkwardly at the rear rather than taking a seat. His expression was unreadable from a distance, but his presence itself represented an unexpected victory. One by one, the graduating teams demonstrated their skills. Apollo guiding his veteran handler through simulated anxiety triggers, Sergeant alerting to sounds for his deaf child partner, a yellow Labrador named Liberty providing mobility support for an elderly former dispatcher. When Emily's turn came, she walked confidently to center stage, Max at perfect heel position beside her. With clear voice and precise movements, she demonstrated their communication system, Max alerting to sounds behind her, responding to hand signals, performing the specialized tasks that helped bridge her auditory processing challenges. Max wasn't broken when we found him, Emily concluded, her young voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. He was just waiting for the right job. I think a lot of people and dogs are like that. They just need someone to see what they can do, not just what they can't do anymore. The simplicity and wisdom of this statement, delivered without pretense or calculation, seemed to touch something in the audience. The applause that followed held a warmth beyond mere politeness. As the formal program concluded and attendees moved toward the refreshment tables, Nancy noticed Frank Peterson still standing at the back, observing with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Taking a deep breath, she made her way toward him. "Thank you for coming, Frank," she said simply. "It means a lot to the program." He nodded stiffly, his gaze fixed on the display of photographs rather than meeting her eyes. "Impressive what you've accomplished," he offered gruffly. "Very professional operation." "We've tried to be thorough," Nancy acknowledged. "Safety has always been our first priority." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Doris told you, didn't she? About my concerns?" "She shared some context that helped me understand your perspective better," Nancy replied carefully. "Vietnam was a different time with different protocols for working dogs." Frank's eyes widened slightly at this direct reference to his past. "She told you about that too." "Just enough to understand that this might be about more than just Max." The acknowledgement hung between them, not quite accusation, not quite absolution, but a recognition of deeper currents beneath surface conflicts. "Those dogs deserve better," Frank said finally, his voice roughened by emotion he clearly hadn't intended to reveal. Left behind like equipment, Handler fought to stay with his dog, but orders were orders. "That Handler," Nancy ventured gently, "was he a friend?" Frank nodded once, a sharp movement. "Saved our unit from an ambush, him and that shepherd. Then, when evacuation came, they said no room for animals. Priorities." The bitterness of 5 decades colored the single word. Understanding bloomed fully. Frank's campaign against Max had never been about the dog himself, but about unresolved guilt, about a debt unpaid to another handler and K9 partner lost to bureaucratic indifference. "Frank," Nancy said carefully, "we have a new placement case coming in next week. A shepherd mix retired from Border Patrol with some trust issues. We could use a volunteer with some military background to help with his transition training." The offer, transparent in its intent but sincere in its opportunity, visibly startled him. "You're asking me to help? After everything?" "The past is past," Nancy said simply. "And Thomas always believed in second chances, for dogs and people." Frank studied her with newfound respect, perhaps recognizing the strength it took to offer reconciliation rather than righteous confrontation. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Not agreement, but not rejection either. As Frank moved away toward the refreshment table, Emily appeared at Nancy's side with Max. "Was that Mr. Peterson?" she asked. "The one who wanted to take Max away?" "Yes," Nancy confirmed. "He's trying to understand things better." Emily considered this with the straightforward wisdom of childhood. Maybe he needs a dog too, she suggested. Someone who doesn't care about what he did wrong before. The innocent insight, so aligned with the philosophy that had guided their journey, struck Nancy as prophetic. Perhaps Frank Peterson's redemption would parallel Max's in ways none of them could yet imagine. As the event wound down, Williams approached Nancy with an official-looking envelope. "The formal evaluation results," he explained. "After today's demonstration, the department has approved permanent service animal designation for Max. No more conditional status, no more quarterly reviews." The document represented the culmination of months of effort, the official recognition of what they had known all along, that Max belonged with them, that his purpose had evolved rather than ended with his police career. "There's something else," Williams added, his usual formality softening slightly. "The department has approved funding for the Thomas Roberts Second Chapter program through next fiscal year. Limited budget, but enough to continue the work you've started." As Williams moved away to speak with Carter, Nancy found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the convergence of victories: Max's permanent status, the program's official recognition, even the small opening toward reconciliation with Frank Peterson. Emily leaned against her side, one hand buried in Max's fur as always. "We did it, Grandma," she said simply. "All of us together." In that moment, Nancy felt Thomas's presence with unusual clarity, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the living continuation of his vision through their actions. The program bearing his name would continue his work of honoring service, of creating second chapters for loyal partners who had given everything. Max looked up at Nancy with calm amber eyes that had seen both battlefield horrors and a child's unconditional love. In his gaze, she read the truth that had guided their journey from the beginning, that healing came through purpose, that family transcended conventional boundaries, and that sometimes the most broken among us held the greatest capacity for restoration. As they gathered their belongings to leave the ceremony, Nancy noticed Frank Peterson kneeling awkwardly to greet Apollo, his hand tentatively extended toward the shepherd who had once swept Afghan villages for explosives and now helped a traumatized veteran navigate civilian life. The dog sniffed Peterson's fingers with professional assessment before allowing a cautious pat, two veterans from different wars finding tentative common ground. In that small moment of connection, Nancy saw the next chapter of their story beginning to unfold, not just Max's journey or Emily's, but a wider healing that rippled outward from their accidental family to touch lives they had not yet imagined reaching. Spring arrived in Arizona with a riot of desert blooms, painting the landscape in unexpected splashes of color against the eternal backdrop of sand and stone. 6 months had passed since the graduation ceremony, transforming what had begun as a desperate fight to keep one dog into a program that had now successfully placed 12 retired K9s with carefully matched families. The Thomas Roberts Second Chapter program occupied a modest storefront on Main Street donated by a local businessman whose grandson had received one of their dogs, a gentle Labrador named Cooper, who had alerted the family to the child's undiagnosed seizure disorder during their home evaluation visit. The space housed a small office for administrative work, a training room for indoor sessions, and a community area where handlers gathered for weekly support meetings. Nancy's dining room table had finally been reclaimed for actual dining, though her home remained the heart of the program in many ways. Emily had established herself as the unofficial mascot and junior trainer, her natural affinity with the dogs earning respect from even the most experienced handlers. Max, now secure in his permanent service designation, carried himself with the quiet dignity of a senior statesman, a living example of the program's vision and possibility. On this particular Saturday morning in April, Nancy watched from the shade of the backyard patio as Emily conducted a training demonstration for a group of visitors from a neighboring county's sheriff's department. At 9 years old, her granddaughter stood with surprising authority before adults 3 and 4 times her age, explaining the communication system she and Max had refined over their time together. The key is understanding that each dog communicates differently, Emily explained, her speech clear and confident in ways that still sometimes surprise Nancy. Max uses his nose to tap my leg for auditory alerts. Apollo prefers to place his paw on his handler's foot. There's no single right way, just what works for each team. The visiting officers watched with professional interest as Emily demonstrated, Max responding to commands both verbal and signed with flawless precision. The shepherd had aged visibly in the past year, more gray around his muzzle, a slight stiffness in his gait on cold mornings, but his intelligence and devotion remained undiminished. Dr. Jenkins, now the program's official veterinary director, stood beside Nancy, recording notes on her tablet. "She's becoming quite the trainer," she observed quietly. "Natural talent combined with genuine empathy, that's rare even among professionals." Nancy nodded, pride warming her chest. "Sometimes I forget she's only 9. The way she explains complex concepts to these officers. Trauma and healing can accelerate maturity," Dr. Jenkins replied thoughtfully. "Both Emily and Max have experienced loss and found purpose through it. That creates a unique perspective." As the demonstration concluded, Nancy noted Frank Peterson among the observers, a sight that still occasionally startled her despite his regular involvement over the past months. After their tentative reconciliation at the graduation ceremony, Frank had indeed volunteered with the Border Patrol shepherd, discovering an unexpected aptitude for working with the more challenging cases. "Dogs don't care about your past mistakes," he'd explained gruffly when Nancy had commented on his natural ability. "They judge you on who you are right now, not who you were 50 years ago." This simple philosophy, so aligned with the program's core values, had gradually transformed Frank from their most vocal opponent to one of their most dedicated volunteers. The neighborhood busybody had found purpose in retirement beyond enforcing HOA regulations, channeling his meticulous record-keeping into training logs and progress reports that were now the envy of similar programs starting in neighboring counties. As the visitors moved inside for refreshments, Officer Carter approached Nancy with a tablet displaying a news article. "Have you seen this? Department just announced formal adoption of permanent retirement protocols for K-9 officers based on our program model." Nancy scanned the article with growing emotion. The policy, approved unanimously by the county supervisors, established mandatory assessment and placement options for retiring police dogs, ending the practice of euthanizing animals deemed unsuitable for civilian adoption due to their training or age. "They're calling it the Roberts Protocol," Carter noted, his weathered face creasing in a rare, full smile. "Thomas would have been over the moon. He would have pretended to be professionally satisfied while doing cartwheels internally," Nancy corrected, remembering her husband's careful balance of official decorum and private enthusiasm. This was exactly what he envisioned. The program's growth had brought challenges as well as triumphs. The increased visibility had attracted scrutiny from various quarters. Animal welfare organizations concerned about placement protocols, liability insurers wary of the specialized risks, law enforcement agencies protective of their training methods. Nancy had navigated these waters with unexpected political skill, drawing on the quiet diplomacy she'd developed through decades as a police officer's wife. Williams had proven an unlikely but valuable ally in these negotiations. His position within animal control and his rigorous adherence to documentation provided credibility with official agencies, while his personal experience with Rex gave him authenticity with handlers concerned about their partners' futures. We've got interest from 3 more departments in neighboring states, he informed Nancy as they reviewed the quarterly reports in her office. They've been watching our outcomes data. The success rates speak for themselves. The statistics were indeed compelling. 12 successful placements, 10 of which involved specific support roles from hearing assistance to PTSD management to medical alert work. The 2 companion-only placements, older dogs with health issues that precluded service certification, were thriving in retirement homes where they received appropriate medical care while providing emotional support to elderly residents. We're going to need more space and additional training staff if we expand regionally, Nancy noted, the former elementary school teacher in her naturally organizing logistics even as she spoke. And the transportation costs for assessment visits will increase significantly. Williams nodded, making notes in his precise handwriting. I've spoken with the department about potential grant funding. Your nonprofit status should help with eligibility. The transformation of their grassroots effort into a formal organization with bylaws, tax status, and grant eligibility still occasionally bemused Nancy. At 68, she had envisioned a quiet retirement focused on raising Emily, not becoming the executive director of a rapidly expanding program. Yet the work energized rather than depleted her, giving purpose to days that might otherwise have been marked primarily by loss and absence. "Ready to head home?" Nancy asked, noting the shadows lengthening across the garden. "Margaret's bringing over that casserole she promised." Emily nodded, marking her place in the book. "I was just telling Max about the new training method Dr. Jenkins mentioned. I think it might help with Sargent's noise sensitivity." Nancy marveled again at how naturally Emily had grown into her role within the program. The shy, withdrawn child who had once hidden behind Nancy's skirts at school functions now confidently advised veteran canine handlers on training techniques, her unique perspective as both a hearing-impaired child and Max's partner giving her insights that even experienced professionals sometimes missed. At home, as they prepared for Margaret's visit, Nancy found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperate fear of losing Max seemed almost like another lifetime, a critical turning point that had opened unexpected doors and healed wounds she hadn't fully acknowledged. "Penny for your thoughts," Margaret said as she arrived, setting her famous tuna casserole on the counter with the confidence of long friendship. "You've got that philosophical look again." Nancy smiled, helping her friend unload the grocery bag of accompanying sides. "Just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if Emily hadn't noticed Max that day at the shelter." "Divine providence," Margaret declared with the certainty of her lifelong faith. "Thomas was watching out for all of you, I'm sure of it." While Nancy's own beliefs ran less definitively toward heavenly intervention, she couldn't entirely dismiss the series of seeming coincidences that had aligned so perfectly. Emily's connection with Max, Carter's knowledge of Thomas's program, even William's hidden history with Rex, that had made him receptive to their case despite his professional reservations. Dinner that evening expanded to include not just Margaret but also Dr. Jenkins and her husband, Officer Carter dropping by for coffee after his shift, and even the Petersons making a brief appearance to drop off training materials Frank had adapted for their newest case. The house that had once echoed with the silence of Nancy's widowhood now regularly hummed with conversation and purpose, becoming a gathering place for the extended family that had formed around the program. As their guests departed and Emily prepared for bed, Nancy found herself drawn to the backyard, where the desert night had painted the landscape in silver moonlight. Max followed, his presence a constant comfort at her side. Together they stood in companionable silence, the shepherd's shoulder pressed lightly against her leg in the subtle physical contact he seemed to know she needed. "We did good, didn't we?" she murmured, more to herself than to the dog. "Thomas would be proud of all this." Max's ears perked at Thomas's name. a reaction Nancy had noticed repeatedly over their time together, strengthening her suspicion that the shepherd had indeed known her husband during his service years, perhaps more directly than records indicated. The peaceful moment was interrupted by Emily's voice from the back door. "Grandma, there's someone on the phone for you. Says it's important." Inside, Nancy took the call with growing astonishment. The caller, a representative from the Governor's Office of Community Relations, explained that the Thomas Roberts Second Chapter program had been selected for special recognition at the upcoming State Service Awards. The governor was particularly impressed by the program's impact on both veteran rehabilitation and children with disabilities, the representative explained. She would like to present the Community Innovation Award personally at next month's ceremony. After confirming details and ending the call, Nancy shared the news with Emily, whose face lit with excitement. "Does this mean we get to meet the governor? Will Max come too?" "It appears so," Nancy confirmed, still processing the unexpected honor. "They specifically mentioned wanting to showcase the work you do together as part of the presentation." Emily's joy bubbled over into an impromptu dance around the kitchen, Max watching with tolerant amusement before joining her excitement with a rare, playful bow. A glimpse of the younger dog he had been before injury and abandonment had dimmed his spirit. Later that night, after Emily had finally settled to sleep with Max in his customary position across her doorway, Nancy found herself drawn to the small memory shelf she had created in the living room. Thomas's photograph stood centered among mementos of their life together, his service medals, the watch he had worn every day of their marriage, the faded corsage from their senior prom she had preserved in a small glass dome. "I wish you could see this," she told his image softly. "Everything you wanted for these dogs is happening now. Emily is thriving. The program bears your name and your vision." She touched the frame gently. "I think maybe you do see it somehow." The morning of the award ceremony dawned clear and bright. Emily had selected her outfit weeks in advance, a blue dress that matched the official program colors, with special accommodations for her hearing aid that Dr. Jenkins' niece, a fashion design student, had helped create. Max had been professionally groomed, his service vest cleaned and emblazoned with both his certification patches and the program logo. Nancy chose to wear the suit she had purchased for Thomas's memorial service, not from morbid connection, but because it seemed fitting to honor him at this moment of recognition for his vision. She added a small pin he had given her on their last anniversary together, a silver shepherd, his acknowledgement of her patient support through his years of canine service. The ceremony was held at the state capitol, a grand affair with representatives from various service organizations across Arizona. The Thomas Roberts Second Chapter program had been allocated prime seating near the stage, their delegation including not just Nancy and Emily with Max, but also Dr. Jenkins, Officer Carter with Ranger, Williams in formal uniform, and 3 of their most successful handler dog teams. As they waited for proceedings to begin, Nancy noticed a distinguished older man in an army dress uniform approaching their section, his attention focused on Frank Peterson, who had insisted on driving separately and arrived just moments before. "Sergeant Peterson?" the man asked, his bearing unmistakably military despite his advanced age. "Frank Peterson, Charlie Company, 1971. Frank stiffened, clearly startled at being addressed by his long-ago rank and unit. "Yes, sir," he replied automatically, the response of a soldier to perceived authority embedded despite the decades between. "Colonel James Harrington," the man introduced himself. "I've been looking for you for some time." Nancy watched this interaction with curious concern, noting how Frank's complexion had paled slightly. Doris reached for her husband's hand with worried eyes. "I don't understand," Frank managed. "Looking for me. Why?" Colonel Harrington glanced around at the gathering crowd, then lowered his voice. About Sergeant Martinez and his K-9 Rex from the Quang Tri evacuation. The name seemed to hit Frank like a physical blow. These were clearly the handler and dog from his Vietnam experience, the ones he had mentioned that day after the graduation ceremony, the loss that had haunted him for 50 years. "I thought we were told they didn't make it out," Frank said, his voice suddenly that of a much younger man facing an old wound reopened. "That was the initial report," the colonel confirmed. "But it was incorrect. They were evacuated on a different transport. Martinez requested that I find the men from his unit once I learned you were involved with this program. He's been trying to locate survivors for years." Frank seemed unable to process this revelation, his usual composure completely abandoned. "Martinez is alive. And the dog?" "Martinez is very much alive. Retired in San Diego. Rex lived to the age of 15, died peacefully in 1986. The colonel reached into his pocket and withdrew a faded photograph. "He wanted you to have this. Said you'd understand its significance." The image showed a younger Martinez with his arm around a German shepherd, both looking battle-worn but very much alive, with a handwritten message across the bottom. "We made it out, too. No man or dog left behind." Nancy watched as 5 decades of guilt visibly lifted from Frank Peterson's shoulders, the weight he had carried since that distant evacuation, the burden that had partially fueled his opposition to Max and the program, suddenly released by the knowledge that the handler and dog he had believed abandoned had survived after all. Before Frank could fully respond to this life-altering news, the ceremony began, calling them all to attention. As they took their seats, Nancy noticed Frank carefully tucking the photograph into his breast pocket, his hand lingering over it as if reassuring himself it was real. The governor's speech highlighted various community services before turning to their program specifically. In a world that too often discards the damaged, devalues the aging, and overlooks the differently abled, the Thomas Roberts Second Chapter program stands as a testament to the power of recognizing continued purpose and potential in all living beings. As the governor invited Nancy, Emily, and Max to the stage to receive the award, Nancy felt a curious sense of completion, not an ending, but the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The small shepherd pin on her lapel caught the stage lights, glinting like a secret message from Thomas. The heavy crystal award felt substantial in her hands as she stepped to the microphone. "My husband believed that service doesn't end when circumstances change. It simply transforms. The dogs in our program embody this principle, finding new ways to contribute after their official duties conclude. But the true miracle has been watching how these animals not only continue to serve, but actually heal the humans partnered with them." She gestured to Emily, who stood proudly beside Max, the shepherd maintaining perfect formal posture despite the unfamiliar environment. "My granddaughter and Max have taught each other languages. Neither was born speaking. Our veterans and their K-9 partners help each other navigate worlds that sometimes seem designed to exclude them. Each team represents a unique conversation between species, between abilities and challenges, between past trauma and future possibility." The applause that followed felt like validation not just of their program, but of the underlying philosophy that had guided Thomas's vision from the beginning, that purpose transcended limitation, that healing came through service to others, that no loyal heart should be discarded simply because its first chapter had concluded. As they returned to their seats, Nancy caught Frank Peterson's eye. The man who had once been their most determined opponent offered a nod of profound respect, his hand still resting protectively over the pocket containing the photograph that had rewritten his personal history after half a century of believing a very different truth. After the ceremony, as they gathered in the Capitol's grand reception hall, Colonel Harrington approached Nancy directly. "Mrs. Roberts, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion on your special day. When I learned of Sergeant Peterson's involvement with your program, it seemed divine timing to deliver Martinez's message personally. No forgiveness needed, Nancy assured him. You've given Frank a tremendous gift today, peace he's needed for decades. The colonel nodded thoughtfully. Working dogs and their handlers develop bonds that civilians sometimes struggle to understand. The partnership transcends ordinary relationships. He glanced toward Max and Emily, who were currently the center of attention among a group of admiring officials. Your program honors that bond. Martinez asked me to convey his personal gratitude for the work you're doing. As the colonel moved away to speak further with Frank, Officer Carter appeared at Nancy's side, Ranger a steady presence beside him. Quite a day, he observed with characteristic understatement. Thomas would be busting his buttons seeing all this. He would indeed, Nancy agreed, watching as Emily demonstrated Max's alert signals to an interested group of education officials. Though I suspect he'd be happier about Frank Peterson's news than about the award itself. Carter nodded knowingly. Thomas always said, the real victories happen one heart at a time, not on stages with plaques. The observation, so characteristic of her late husband, brought both a pang of loss and a wave of gratitude to Nancy. Thomas's physical presence had been taken from them, but his vision, his values, his understanding of what truly mattered continued to guide their path. As the reception concluded and they prepared to leave, Emily approached with an unexpected request. Grandma, can we stop somewhere on the way home? There's something I want to do with the award before we take it back to the program office. The somewhere proved to be the cemetery where Thomas was buried, a peaceful place with desert landscaping and mountains visible in the distance. Nancy had visited regularly in the years immediately following his death, less frequently as the raw edges of grief had gradually softened. Emily had accompanied her occasionally, but had never before requested a visit on her own initiative. They walked together to Thomas's grave, Max moving with dignified slowness beside Emily, seeming to understand the solemnity of the location. The headstone was simple, as Thomas had wanted. His name, his dates, his service noted with quiet pride. Emily carefully placed the crystal award against the headstone, positioning it so the afternoon sun caught its facets, sending small rainbows dancing across the engraved letters of Thomas's name. I thought Grandpa should see it first, she explained, her young voice carrying the gravity of one much older. Since it was his idea that started everything. Nancy felt tears threatening, not the drowning grief of early widowhood, but a bittersweet acknowledgment of all that had been lost and all that had been found in the journey since. She placed her arm around Emily's shoulders, Max pressing against their legs in the physical contact that had become his way of sharing both joy and sorrow. That's perfect, sweetheart, she managed. Absolutely perfect. They stood together in companionable silence, the three of them united by circumstance and choice and love, while desert breezes stirred the memorial flowers and distant church bells marked the passage of time. The Crystal Award continued its light show across Thomas's name, a fitting metaphor, Nancy thought, for how his vision had cast illumination into so many lives. As they eventually turned to leave, Nancy glanced back once more at the headstone with its temporary decoration. The program, the award, the lives changed, all of it stemming from one man's belief that service animals deserved better endings to their stories, and from one child's ability to see value where others saw only damage. Ready to go home? She asked Emily, who nodded and gave a hand signal to Max. The shepherd rose from his sitting position with the careful movements of a senior dog, but his eyes remained bright and alert, his purpose undimmed by age or injury. Together they walked back toward the car, three unlikely companions bound by loss and healing, by service and need, by the miraculous second chances that sometimes emerge from life's most devastating interruptions. Behind them, the Crystal Award continued its rainbow dance across a fallen officer's name, light refracted, transformed, and multiplied, touching far more than its source could ever have imagined possible. Life's deepest fulfillment often arrives in unexpected packages, doesn't it? Nancy's journey with Emily and Max reminds us that our greatest chapters may begin precisely when we think our story is ending. At 67, widowed and raising her hearing-impaired granddaughter, Nancy never imagined becoming the director of a canine retirement program. Yet in this second chapter, she found purpose that honored her late husband's vision while healing wounds she'd carried silently for years. Like Max, the battle-scarred shepherd who transformed from an unadoptable liability into a healing presence, we too can discover new purpose regardless of age or circumstance. The program that began as one woman's fight to keep her granddaughter's dog blossomed into a movement that changed countless lives, proving that our most meaningful contributions might still lie ahead of us. Have you discovered an unexpected second chapter in your own life after loss or retirement? Or perhaps you've witnessed how an animal's unconditional love helped someone heal from grief. Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.